Good morning. I'm Joan McGrath. Most Americans find South Africa's system of racial apartheid morally indefensible, but critics vary on whether it is morally defensible or even possible for Americans to affect the internal affairs of another nation. This is Johann Grobler, who's the Consul for Information for the South African Consulate General in the city of Chicago. Also with us today, Dr. Conrad Worrill, Professor of History at Northeastern Illinois University Center for Inner City Studies and the Chairman of the Black United Front of Chicago. A debate rages next on Dimensions. Change? Can third parties successfully pressure officials regarding issues to which they have no apparent connection? For example, did the pro-solidarity marches down the streets of Chicago appreciably help Lech Walesa? Can a hunger strike by the guardian angels, self-appointed New York subway watchdogs, contribute to freeing accused rapist Gary Dotson? On a more global level, we are witnessing third-party protests in opposition to South Africa's system of racial apartheid. Americans are picketing South African consulates in Chicago and around the country. Financial institutions, including giant Citibank, have stopped loans to the South African government. In Illinois, a proposal before the Senate Insurance Committee would prohibit public employee pension funds from investing in companies that do business with South Africa. Will these protests have a significant impact, or are they seen as interference? On Dimensions this morning, we're going to put those and other questions to Johann Grobler, who's the Consul for Information at the South African Consulate General's office here in Chicago, and also to Dr. Conrad Worrill, Professor of History at Northeastern Illinois University Center for Inner City Studies and the Chairman of the Black United Front of Chicago. Dr. Worrill, let me start with you. Do you think we can realistically punish or change or shape policy in another nation by the protesting we do here in Chicago? Did the polls in Chicago help Lech Walesa? Did the Shah of Iran fall because of protests in America?
Well, I don't think the questions are that clear-cut. On the question of South Africa and the relationship to the protests that are going on in the United States at this particular time, I think there's a direct relationship. First of all, the United States is already involved with the South African government. It already has a relationship with the South African government, as other Western nations in the world, France, Britain, Germany, and so forth. These are the nations that prop up the government of South Africa. The United States has over 350 American corporations do business in South Africa, and the United States government has a policy in South Africa called constructive engagement. So the United States, aside from the United States government, that is, aside from the people in the United States who are protesting not only the policies of the United States government with regard to South Africa, but the policies of the South African government itself, I think what you're seeing is a momentum of the whole world watching one of the most racist regimes in the whole world, that certainly these particular demonstrations right here in Chicago will have some influence.
All right, you've isolated two areas. One is a moral platform. The other is an economic platform. In any way, shape, or form, would economic sanctions against South Africa alter the policies of apartheid that are currently the policies of your government?
John, I don't say South Africa is an island, but I do want to say that pressures like this, and especially economic pressures, will make it even more harder and worse for the South African government to set forth the line of change that they have taken, and especially a line of change that started since the administration of the present president, Mr. P.W. Botha, where changes across the whole and the broad field of the South African life have changed to the better, especially for the black people in South Africa. If you look at the tremendous, phenomenal changes in the labor field, for instance, you know, 5, 6 years ago, no black or colored or Indian could be trained as in skilled labor, skilled man, technician, or even be a manager of white people. But conservatively estimated, today there's 30% of the skilled and managerial positions in South Africa are being held by the black people.
I know Dr. Worrill is going to want to jump in here, and that we will discuss these specific points of disagreement between you. But get back to my question just for a moment. Senator Ted Kennedy proposed economic sanctions against the South African government. Citibank, which is a largest bank in our country, has determined that it will no longer grant any loans to the South African government. What does that mean?
It means if the support that South African economy do get from overseas, from the United States, to a certain extent also, because we are rather good trading partners. If economic sanctions would be imposed where South Africa is being cut off from the rest of the world, first of all, you will have the black people who do not have the skills, who are not the trained people, who do not have senior positions in government, in business and so on. They will be the first ones to lose their jobs. Okay. But a very important factor here is that we have 300,000 to 400,000 people from the neighboring black countries like Swaziland and Lesotho, Botswana, Mozambique, working in South Africa, in the mines, in jobs that the South African black people prefer not to do because it's hard work. They will, I believe, be the first ones that will lose their jobs so that South African black people can take up the positions there. So it's an effect, and circling, a rippling effect, that if you institute sanctions that will cause hardships, the government of South Africa, I believe, will just draw an, as we call it in Afrikaans, a laar, put the wagons together and just be harder on any changes.
Agree or disagree, Dr. Worrill?
Well, I think that what we really need to understand is what the situation is in South Africa. South Africa is a part of the history of the continent of Africa. It is the last country in Africa that one could call that's dominated by colonialism and imperialism. That is to say that there was an independence movement in Africa wherein Kenya became the first country to become independent in the modern period in history. South Africa is the last country that is under colonial rule that dominates the black majority, that the black people are fighting to win their country back. In fact, South Africa is a land that belongs to the black African people in that region of the world. The minority government of South Africa, the white people, the Dutch and the British people and the Portuguese and the French people and the Jewish people who reside in South Africa are people who came as settlers. So if one doesn't understand that particular conception of the country, we get caught in a trap, really, when we begin to talk about change, because the question is, what do the black people, the black majority in South Africa, really want? And they tell us they want their government back, they want their country back, they want their land back.
You are somewhat ignoring my question, however, which was, if American companies are willing to take a moral position and stop loans to the South African government, will it be the black people who suffer?
The black people in South Africa are already suffering. It wouldn't make any difference at all whether or not the United States or the governments or the investments in South Africa. That has nothing to do with it.
It is not helping your cause either.
What I'm saying here, it wouldn't make any difference whether or not, if the 350 corporations pull out of South Africa tomorrow, it wouldn't have any effect on the black people of South Africa. The black people of South Africa would be glad if these corporations pull out of South Africa. That's what I'm saying. You know, and he is making an assumption that the white people in South Africa, without the white people in South Africa, that the black people in South Africa couldn't survive. That's the subtlety of his argument.
You know, John, I disagree with Dr. Worrill.
I had a feeling you might.
Yes. First of all, South Africa is not a colonial entity. The argument is that the white people, my ancestors who came there in 1652, my personal ancestor from northern Germany in 1696, if I'm a colonial man, then all the white people on this continent, all the black people on this continent must also go back to their different countries. So let's get away from those old rhetoric of colonialism, because the Afrikaner people were the first on the African continent fighting colonialism in the late 1800s.
Let me put a question straight out to you. You're obviously frequently in the position of defending this system of apartheid, this system which denies privileges and rights to the black majority. And we're talking a majority of 73%. It must be very difficult for you to defend.
It's not difficult. First of all, I don't defend apartheid as it was perceived by most Americans of 3 years ago. Secondly, there's no black majority in South Africa. South Africa is a country who the people of South Africa didn't even have an opportunity to have a say in the drawing of the borderlines. The borderlines of South Africa was drawn by the British colonial power, grouping together 12 different nations together. 9 of them happen to be black people, but they are as different as the Greeks and the Turks and the English and the French and the Germans.
Mr. Grobler, that doesn't answer my question. My question is, we read in the newspaper about a virtual police state surrounding the black townships. We read of mass arrests. We read of bloodshed. We read that blacks can't vote, that blacks have no rights. How do you defend the system that we read about? Are our perceptions wrong? Are we reading inaccuracies?
No, it's actually selective morality in the case of South Africa. Just want to say this, in South Africa it's not the only country in the world that things like inadequacies, worse things and bad things like this happen. But and South Africa is in a flux of change. The change being instituted by the present government, who is definitely not a rightist government. We've got radicals to the right, radicals to the left. We're moving into a time period that's very fascinating for South Africa, and I can agree with you that we will even have still more violence and unrest, because the leftists do not want this evolutionary change to proceed, and they are instigating violence. They are beating up black people, they are killing black people, they are burning. They've, during the last 3 months, killed 75 black people. They've burned down 300 houses of black people. Those are the people, the moderate people in South Africa, black people who want to further the changes, evolutionary-wise and not revolutionary-wise.
Dr. Worrill, I seem to be hearing 2 different things. One, that things are getting better for black South Africans, and 2, that it's mostly black-on-black crime. The whites aren't participating. Respond to those 2 things.
Well, before I respond to those 2 things, I think we have to respond to Mr. Grobler and then the 2 things. Mr. Grobler is suggesting that the blacks in South Africa are not the majority, and what is called by anthropologists as tribes or kinship groups in South Africa are historically disconnected from each other, so therefore they are not the majority. That is the Xhosa, the Zulu, etc. And I think that is the most culturally imperialistic statement that one could ever make, to suggest that the African people, the black South African people, are not historically tied to each other. And that is to say, the white people in South Africa, the minority, the French, the British, the Dutch, are somehow all one group and are viewed as one group and are not viewed as kinship groups. So on that particular point, I would say that Mr. Grobler is just absolutely incorrect in his conception of the racial composition of South Africa. But in regards to black on black, what the South African government is pushing is that black people are killing black people. And that is true. Black people are killing black people, and they are killing the black people who are working with the government to oppress the black people in South Africa. It's a special group of black people who are being killed by black people.
The so-called collaborators.
Collaborators, Uncle Toms, if you will, in more colloquial terms. So that in fact is going on, but that does not speak to the 300 black people who have been killed at the hands of the government over the last year. And in fact, since the beginning of the year, over 100 black people have been killed by the police. The struggle in South Africa is intensifying inside the country. In 1960, with the Sharpeville incidents, the demonstrations against the passbook, my goodness, in South Africa, black people have to carry a pass to get around the country. That is, if in Chicago, if I lived in Robbins and wanted to come downtown, I would have to have a pass. And black people protested against this unjust law. And there was a massacre at Sharpsville with over 69 black people were killed, hundreds more were wounded, and hundreds more fled the country. 1976 at Soweto, you had over 2,000 black people who were killed. Thousands more fled the country. And what you find right now in South Africa is that the black people in South Africa are not fleeing the country. They're digging in, and they're fighting back, and they're trying to win their country back. And I think that Mr. Grobler is trying to represent, from a public relations standpoint, to try to impress to the world community that real change is occurring in South Africa when we know that that is not the case.
Your turn, Mr. Grobler.
Yes, you know, unfortunately, Dr. Worrill has never been to South Africa. I don't know whether he's been even in any African country. So for him to, you know, just go on and on the old cliches and the rhetoric, although I do not condone any one of the deaths during the last year or during the last years, but for a person like that to just use the old rhetoric on South Africa, I don't take it. You know, and there's one thing I just wanted to say. The crux of South Africa's situation is that we are a country with diversities in our, not only the population as far as their language is concerned, but the cultures, the ethnic heritages. And you know, it's so strange that Dr. Worrill will agree to me, there's an independent country called Lesotho. There's one that's in South Africa borders, Botswana, Swaziland, Mozambique. The people living in those areas are Swazis, Tswanas, South Sothos, and Shonas. But the moment they are put into the South African border, in the South African context, they are in majority. And that kind of selective morality, you know, it doesn't go off.
I must confess I'm a little lost with the anthropological argument. Let me change the subject slightly. Why now? Why are we hearing about violence in South Africa today, 1985? Why is it that Ted Koppel took Nightline to South Africa for a week? Why hasn't the repression been going on for many decades, and why has it become accelerated now?
Well, I think that essentially the world community is watching South Africa.
Why?
Because South Africa probably represents the last bastion of white supremacy in the world. You have a blatant case. You have no other case in the world that is so blatant, whereas the 4.5 million white people who reside in South Africa control government and dominate over 23 to 24 million black people in South Africa on their own land. I don't think you have any other case in the world where you find that kind of situation.
And I go back again. It's obvious, clear that Dr. Worrill has never been to South Africa. The South African government exists of white people, 2.7 million colored people of mixed racial descent, and nearly 1 million Asian people at this stage. They have the vote. But just last week, the president of South Africa said, and he said that in '84, when the new parliament started, this is not the end, the new constitution, with only the colored people and the Asians in the government. He said this is only the start of the changes still to come. Last week, the president said the citizenship of the urbanized black people who left their own historical areas are going to be looked into, and very soon. The influx, and then Dr. Worrill mentioned that people cannot move from this area to the other area. Agreed, yes, but there are certain reasons for it. The government said it's going to take away the county border, so to speak, that black people can move everywhere where they like to have the opportunity to sell their labor if there's jobs available.
You know what? This is incredible, because in South Africa, I don't know if you're aware that 87% of the land in South Africa is controlled by this minority white population, whereas 13% of the land, black people, the majority, live on, which is the worst land in the country. In addition to that, South Africa has constructed a policy called the Bantustans. That is, the black people, the majority, live on the periphery of the major cities in South Africa, and the white people in South Africa, who constitute the minority, live in the urban populations. Mr. Grobler has said, I'd like for the record, I have been to Africa, and I have studied this situation for most of my life as a professional. I don't think it's a question of whether or not I've been to Africa or South Africa. I think it's a question of people having their eyes on. Their eyes are on straight in the world. The world is coming down on South Africa, and it's only a matter of time before the regime in South Africa will fall.
Please, Dr. Worrill, just proceed and say that the 87% of the land which the white people own or have say over, nearly 50% of it is either desertous or semi-desertous. Nearly 45% of the arable land in South Africa belongs to the black people, and that is the areas where they settled 300 years ago. And if they were foolish to settle in the arid areas in South Africa, they would have been foolish, but they did not.
I want to get back to something you said before, and that was a statement about the current makeup of the parliament. There is total exclusion of blacks.
Correct.
Coloreds, mixed race, Asians, whites are represented, blacks are not. What is it that South Africans are afraid of in terms of extending full rights and privileges to the black majority?
We are extending it. If you asked what afraid of, I think we just have to cast our eyes to the rest of Africa, where you have more than 30 one-party states, more than 9 military dictatorships, and I think Nigeria is, no, Sudan is the most recent one, where South Africa is in the same boat as the rest of Africa, where the European powers cut up Africa in portions, cutting up tribes, nations, families, putting people together that do not belong together to find a solution for an sort of a government to rule and reign it. But getting back to the Dr. Worrill's argument, that I still say that 45% of those arable land belong to the black people. The reason why the black people at this stage do not have the vote is that the different groups can only claim sort of responsibility over the areas where they settled 100, 200, 300 years ago. Now, I just want to proceed with this. 2 years ago, already the government in South Africa appointed a senior cabinet commission. 7 senior cabinet ministers sits on this commission and invites now the black people, black leaders, and not the stooges and the puppets, as Dr. Worrill said, but the ones responsible people from the professional field, lawyers, judges, magistrates, doctors, educationists, business people, to come and sit around a table to find the solutions, because I think the world will agree that South Africa have got very, very unique, not unique, but difficult situations. We've got to find the solutions for that. And the black people are invited now, and we are moving into a situation where they will also have the vote.
I asked you a couple of moments ago why I am just hearing about the problems in South Africa, why this enormous publicity explosion, if it were. And one of the reasons I suspect, if I can answer my own question, is the naming of Desmond Tutu as the Nobel Peace Prize winner. What impact did that have? Now,
He wasn't the first black person from South Africa to receive a Nobel Peace Prize.
The last time was in 1960,
I think that yes. I think that you have a combination of factors that are causing the South African situation to become so well known throughout the world. I think when men like Stevie Wonder receives his Oscar on worldwide television and gives his Oscar to Nelson Mandela, who the black people in South Africa say should be the prime minister. And then the next day, the South African radio station banned Stevie Wonder. When those kinds of things happen, I think the everyday man on the street begins to see the blatant racism that exists in South Africa.
The reason I brought up Desmond Tutu's name was in response to what you said about an open dialogue being initiated. He doesn't agree with you.
On what?
On the fact that there is open dialogue.
He obviously do not agree, but there's hundreds and thousands, millions of black people, moderate people, and hundreds of leaders, real leaders, who are prepared to work with the South African government not to devastate the country, the economic basis. Why do we only hear 1 or 2 or 3 people, Nelson Mandela? And Dr. Worrill again said, leader of the black people. What black people? Is he the leader of the Zulus or the Xhosas? For instance,
this is the problem.
No.
Are you a leader of representing the white government in South Africa?
Let me just proceed.
The white government doesn't break itself down into the British, the Dutch, the French, the German, you represent the white government of South Africa. Your conception, I think really the argument of the white supremacist government of South Africa is so ludicrous. Just recently, last week, they announced that they're going to pass some legislation that allows black people and white people to get married if they choose. And they say that if the black people and the white people get married in South Africa, they can only live in the black community. The rationale, the mentality of the South African government is the same mentality of the Nazi government that existed during the period of Hitler. It's the same rationale. It's the same kind of supremacy with regards to the treatment of black people in their own country.
Mr. Grobler, a quick response, then I have another question. We are rapidly running out of time.
That's a misrepresentation of the situation. Dr. Worrill says we are making a law for people to intermarry of different races. That's nonsense. That's nonsense. A law was made 30 years ago that said people of different races may not marry. This is just the intent of the government is within the next 2 weeks, when it's passed through Parliament, the old law will be scrapped. So it's not a law making people going to marry into marriage.
It is a slightly different orientation. Let me ask a question. Do you fear civil war? Will it come to that?
That is the reason why we've got to find the solutions in going step by step by step. Nowhere else in the rest of Africa did we see a just society when the colonial powers left, and left the people there without the techniques, the knowledge to build up their own country. But put them together, a lot of group of different people, and they left. We fear civil war in South Africa because we just see over our borders where Zimbabwe or Rhodesia is being held as a model for South Africa. There's only two black groups, the Shonas and the Ndebelés, and they kill each other, 2,000 at a time. And you know, that kind of selective morality is applied to South Africa. 1 minute,
Dr. Worrill. Do you see the blacks taking up arms in South Africa? Do you see continued...
The black people in South Africa began taking up arms in the 1960s. And this is not generally talked about in the press. There's an armed struggle going on in South Africa.
Would you call it a civil war?
I would call it an armed struggle. I would call it a revolution. And the revolution is for black people in South Africa to win their country back and dismantle the system of apartheid and dismantle the white supremacist government. I think that on the question of the composition of this country and whether or not the black people and the white people in America should go back to wherever they came from, I mean, we can argue that because the white people who came here and settled wiped out the Indians, and the Indians are still saying that they have claims and territory to the United States. So I think that we can't dismiss the fact that the people who constitute the government of South Africa are settlers. They have intruded into a country that didn't belong to them, and the people in South Africa are fighting to win their country back.
Two-word response.
Yes. First of all, we did not wipe out the blacks in South Africa.
You have attempted.
No, we did not. We treated with it. We did have wars and so on, but we, the areas where they settled, they were granted, or they were recognized.
That was more than 2 words, and we are out of time. I regret that, gentlemen, because the argument is so important. I know you two have resisted appearing together, and I appreciate your doing so on this program. We're very grateful to have you. My guests have been Johann Grobler, who is with the South African Consul General's office in Chicago, and Dr. Conrad Worrill, who is the chairman of the Black United Front of Chicago, which is an organization which seeks to support the South African blacks. I'm Joan McGrath. This is Dimensions. Have a good day.